So recapping where we've been, we've still got our working definition of violence as that which opposes God and God's goodwill for creation, that which opposes the righteousness and justice of God, stepping out of our place in the created order, wanting more, violating the place that God has given to others in the created order by trying to take what rightfully belongs to them, or kind of diminish them from their space in the created order for our own benefit. But I think it's working out pretty well so far. At first I was a little skeptical because that's a very different definition than what we get in, in society and in our culture today. But so far I think it's working out pretty well and helping us to frame some of these stories really well.
Can you repeat that definition of violence that you started with?
Sure. So that which opposes God and God's goodwill for the creation.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. So we talked about with the Noah story how God chooses to be in relationship with us violent, awful, evil creations, even though we are evil from our youth, even though evil is part of who we are, our violence is ingrained. God chooses to be in relationship with us, and not just that, but to work through us, to use us as tools to bring restoration and justice and righteousness back to the creation, which frankly I don't think is the greatest plan. Use the problem to come up with a solution, but I'm not God, thank goodness. And then last week we started on kind of some thematic ideas and talked about God as a warrior and focused on the idea that whenever God is discussed as or kind of described as a warrior, we're focused on restorative justice, not retribution. So God is not in the business of punishing just for the sake of punishing. God is in the business of battling on behalf of the creation, working to defend and restore the creation, but also remembering that the very person or thing or group that is causing the problem, causing the threat, is also a creation, and therefore is also part of God's restorative work. And so somehow we have to balance that we can be in opposition to the behaviors or choices of a group or a person, because what they are doing is violent in the biblical sense. It is opposed to God. It is attempting to undermine God's sovereignty. But at the same time, remembering that it's not just what they are hurting that we need to protect, but they themselves are also part of God's creation and therefore worthy of that restorative justice as well. And then additionally, these images of God as warrior almost always come hand in hand with images of God as creator, to remind us that God is in control. God owns, so to speak, creation because it was created by God. So God's sovereignty is supreme, and that violence in terms of attempting to take that from God is on its face absurd, because God created everything. God is in control of everything that God created. How could we possibly think that we could take that right from God? But I think, the next question that kind of came to my mind as we talked about that last week was, what do we do when God's interactions with violence do harm to those who are around the target? So if God is working to address, the wrongdoing, the evil, the violence of a particular individual or group, a lot of times there are, what we would call innocent bystanders. And so today's lesson I'm calling Innocent Bystanders in quotation marks. And then additionally, what do we do when it seems like God is kind of taking advantage of the whole all-seeing, all-knowing, all-controlling thing? What do we do when it seems like God is manipulating a person or a group in order for them to, do the wrong thing or to do something that then God says, and now I am going to use this situation to bring glory to myself? Well, that doesn't seem very fair. You create this person, and then the person does something wrong because you made them do it, and then you punish them for having done it so that you can seem powerful. That seems pretty manipulative to me. And so we have to kind of explore that a little bit today. So I have two stories, two passages that I want to look at today. Maybe a third if we have time and the conversation is kind of going in that direction, but it's not nearly as important as the other two. And both of these stories actually are pretty central to what we talked about last week with some of the stories that we were looking at last week. The first one is the story of Sodom, which we looked at the introduction to last week to learn about the purpose, Abraham's purpose in being called. And then the other one is the plagues in Egypt that we didn't really talk as much about last week, even though we did talk about the Red Sea. So to get us started, let's start with any questions on any of the stuff from last week, any of the things that I've said so far before we jump into the actual readings. Nothing. All right, great. Okay, so let's start then with the story of Sodom, which appears in Genesis chapters 18 and 19.
Okay.
All right. So because this is long, I don't think we need to read the whole thing, but just to kind of recap a little bit, we started at the beginning of chapter 18 last week and read the first kind of paragraph-ish or not the beginning of the chapter, the beginning of the second half of the chapter with my title is Judgment Pronounced on Sodom. So this is after the men, angels, messengers, representatives of God came to announce that Sarah's going to have a baby. She laughs. They say, "Why are you laughing?" And then they get up and kind of get ready to leave. And so again, if we're looking at these stories from this perspective of violence and trying to figure out what violence is, the progression from the story that precedes this into this conversation is not nearly as stark as you might think. Because the story, of course, is about the pronouncement of Isaac's future birth, but it also highlights heavily the hospitality that Abraham shows to these strangers, these men who are traveling that he sees in the distance, and immediately jumps up and starts preparing and begs them to stay and eat with him and rest in the shade of his tent and all these things. So he does this, and then it transitions into this conversation about Sodom, and we'll see that in Sodom, the complete opposite is what is occurring. But first, just to kind of to recap and make sure that we have this in our minds, this is the passage that, as kind of almost a throwaway aside, really gives us, as people of Abraham, as people of God, a clear statement of what it is that is our purpose. Why did God call Abraham? Why does God have a special people? And verse 19 says, "I have chosen him that he may charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. And so that is the purpose of God's call to us, to keep the way of righteousness and justice, or keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. So then from there, what we have to figure out is, what does that mean? What are those words, righteousness and justice? And how are they defined within the Bible? And so we have to kind of look at, I think, and you know, not everyone agrees with me on this, but I think that the way that you answer that kind of question is to look at the canon as a whole, look at what we're calling the meta-narrative, the theological rocks, the boulders, the most important things. And so I want to just take a really quick tangent trip into Psalm 72. So if you can kind of keep your finger in Genesis, and we can move quickly to Psalm 72. I want to take a look at that to help us to figure out what it is that we're talking about here. And we're just going to read verses 1 through 4. If we could have somebody read those for us.
It's Psalm 72. Is that what you wanted, Katie?
Yep, verses 1 through 4.
I'll read it for you.
Thank you.
Endow the king with your justice, O God, the royal son with your righteousness. He will judge your people in righteousness, your afflicted ones with justice. The mountains will bring prosperity to the people, the hills the fruit of righteousness. He will defend the afflicted among the people and save the children of the needy. He will crush the oppressor.
Okay. So this psalm is about, you know, on the face of it, it's about asking God to help the king, to support the king, to kind of make the king righteous, to make the king right and make right decisions in the face of, you know, in the face of God. But if we kind of expand this out to represent not just the king, but the, you know, the kind of the larger role of humanity, then I think this expresses to us, you know, what is the principle on which the earth is created? What does Eden look like? What is God's intention for the earth, for the creation, for all of humanity? And we've got words in here. Mine, I don't remember what Steve said in, for verse 3, but mine says, "May the mountains yield prosperity for the people." And that word prosperity is the word shalom, which a lot of us have heard before, has to do not just with peace, but with wholeness, with the completeness of the way that God wants things to be. So shalom means rightness. Shalom means the way things should be, the way things were created to be. But you notice, and Steve, your translation used the word afflicted several times, and
Yes.
I think that's an interesting comparison, because mine says the poor. Mine has the word poor 3 different times. It says, "May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. May he defend the cause of the poor of the people and give deliverance to the needy." So I find that really interesting. You know, afflicted can mean various different things, and kind of has a different nuance perhaps than poor in our vernacular today. Certainly they can be connected if we're talking about economic affliction, or, you know, you can be poor in different ways, but we don't tend to equate those 2 words as synonyms. So
Right.
that's interesting, but kind of gives us a broad range of
This one
understanding.
puts stand up for the poor, help the children of the needy.
Yeah. So
Come down hard on the cruel tyrants.
yeah. So it seems like if we kind of combine all of our different translations, that we're talking about, we're focusing our attention on those who are vulnerable, those who are economically vulnerable, those who are ill, those who, frankly, just are not of value to the society, whether because they don't have money, whether because they don't have health, whether because they don't have the right connections. That for the Bible, justice, righteousness is about the way things should be. And according to this, the way things should be is that we are always defending the cause of the poor, the afflicted, the needy, and coming down hard on those who might try to oppress those people. And so according to this passage, righteousness means making sure that the people that God has created who are in vulnerable positions maintain or even improve their position, because the good order, the way that God created us, is for everyone to be in their place. And if they don't have enough to eat, if they are ill, if they're not taken care of, then they are not in the right place. They do not have what it is that they were created to get, to deserve. Does that make sense to everyone? Any questions on that? Comments?
Funny how you get a bunch of different words out of the same phrase.
Yeah. Yes, always remembering. And that's something that, sometimes I kind of forget when I'm in the midst of reading for planning a lesson or planning a sermon. You cannot hinge an entire message on one word, because in English anyway, because every translation is an interpretation. You have to choose which word you're going to use, and that word is going to guide people to kind of come to a different conclusion depending on which word they have, which Bible they have. And so, if I had been preaching a sermon on that passage, Psalm 72, and I had gone on and on about the poor, I don't think I was completely correct, because it's not just the poor. If we've got all of these combinations of translations, then we're talking about several different things. So, and that's kind of why they make you, when you go to seminary, learn the Hebrew at least to a degree, learn the Greek at least to a degree, so that you have at least a little bit of access to what as close to the original as you can anyway. The other problem, of course, comes with which version of which scroll do you use, and which one do you say is the official thing, and how do we know that scribes didn't add extra suggestions and commentaries later, and all that kind of stuff. But that's a whole different conversation. We don't have to get into that today. But having multiple copies of the Bible when you're studying something, especially difficult passages, I think is really helpful. We've got a whole wall of Bibles of different translations. And today it's easy. You just go online, and there are multiple websites that have dozens of different translations in dozens of different languages to take a look at different ones. Yeah, Pam.
And how do you know if it's difficult?
This is true. I think that every passage can be difficult.
Yeah, because it seems like it's a minefield of translation. So.
Yeah, and I don't know that if it's difficult until you look at at least two different translations and say, hey, these are kind of saying different things here. Maybe I should look a little deeper with this. So maybe you should always have, when you do Bible study, you need to get get your dining room table and empty it out, and have 16 or 17 different books open at the same time. All right, so back to our Genesis then, after that little side trip. So as we move through this story, I'm gonna kind of skip over the conversation between Abraham and God about the, if you find 50 righteous people, are you still going to destroy it? No, I won't. If you find 10 righteous people, are you going to destroy it? No, I won't. I don't think the purpose of that story is to, make us concerned about God being wishy-washy, or concerned that God is going to be unfair and kill people who are righteous. I think the purpose of that section is to highlight that Abraham is doing his job. His purpose is to defend those who are righteous and just, defend those who God has called him to defend, but also to, make sure that they are defended, which means, of course, getting involved in some of these disagreements, conflicts, battles, whatever image you want to use. And I don't think, when it came down to it, obviously God did destroy the city, but God took out the ones who were righteous and placed them in safety before the destruction occurred. And you see that God is not in the business of causing damage to those who do not need that wake-up call. If 10 people had been found in the city, the entire city would have been spared. So blessings from God are something that trickle out from those who behave rightly, those who are just and righteous. But unfortunately, in this particular case, as we'll find out, there were no people. There were not 10 righteous people, and so the city was still destroyed. So moving on then to chapter 19, which kind of has the core of the story. We often, and we've talked about this in the past, we often hear this story as a defense for those who believe that homosexuality is a sin, that we should condemn homosexuality in the church. But I feel like by this point, unless you're somebody who is looking for an excuse, at least this particular passage has already been proven not to have anything to do with that. We've kind of come to a consensus that unless you're looking for proof for a position you already take, that reading this passage is not going to require you to change your opinion or choose a certain opinion about that particular issue, because it has nothing to do with that. What it has to do with is hospitality, that and that's how it's connected to the story that precedes it. So Abraham gets up and he sees these people coming in the distance, and he immediately jumps up and he bends over backwards to welcome them, to make sure that they're comfortable, to make sure that they're well fed, and they have water, they have good conversation. His wife, they sacrifice food, which of course is difficult to come by, so that these random strangers that are passing by can be taken care of. And then when they get to Sodom, it's the same thing. Lot saw them, he got up, he bowed down, he said, please, I want you to come and spend the night at my house. It's really important that you do that. They said, no, it's okay, we'll stay in the square. No, he said, you can't do that, you must come. And so they did go to his house. He fed them, they ate. But then it says in verse 4, before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And so we are getting to the point of, it's kind of ridiculous that the writer goes to pains to say that literally every single person from this city was surrounding his house. Now, I don't know that is actually true. But I think the message there, the purpose in saying that and heavily emphasizing it, has to do with the, using Sodom kind of less as a historical account, and again, as we've seen in the past, more as a model, more as an archetype for what what is the message that this story is trying to send. The exaggeration, the all or nothing kinds of descriptions, I think is there to indicate that to us, that we're not looking, that we shouldn't read this story looking for, history. We should read this story looking for, what does this mean? How is this going to guide us in how we live our lives? And so every single person is there. There are absolutely no other righteous people in the city. And what is it that they are doing? They are violating the righteousness of God, the call of God to take care of the most vulnerable among you. And who are the most vulnerable among you? Well, people who don't have enough money, of course, people who, the other ones that we talked about, people who are ill, but also strangers. When we talked about Abraham's call and how he was told to leave his family, that was just something that was not done. And the reason for that was because you can't just get up and go and move to a different city and reestablish yourself. That's not how it works. You must connect with your family, with your father and your grandfather and your great-grandfather and your great-great-grandfather. Everything you know, everything you are, your entire identity, your relationship with the community is all wrapped up in the family that you belong to. And so if you're traveling, it's not just that, you're vulnerable to bad guys, thieves and bandits on the highway, like in the story of the Good Samaritan. You are identityless. You are not necessarily even, fully human, because you don't have those connections to the people that you belong to. And therefore, you're a nobody, you're nothing. And so the Bible emphasizes over and over and over this theme about aliens, strangers and aliens. You constantly hear, for you were strangers in Egypt, homeless wanderers, and I have given you a home. Therefore, you must treat the stranger at your gate with respect and love and righteousness and justice. And so you can see here that we're kind of creating with this flow of information, that what is righteousness, what is justice? It has to do in this particular case with the way that we treat strangers and aliens. And even not just these guys, but it says in verse 9, the men surrounding the house said, this fellow, Lot, came here as an alien, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. And so again, even though Lot has lived there clearly long enough to establish a house and have daughters and everything, and be able to do things like sit by the city gate, he still is not considered an insider. It reminds me of the experience that we had in Pennsylvania. Bob was the pastor of a very small church way out in the country, and the county that it was in was called Perry County. And in Perry County, if you're not born there to a family that's been there for a long time, you don't belong. There was a man in the church who was elected to the council, and every time he spoke, every time he voiced an opinion about something, he always started it with, I know I'm not from around here, but, and the reason he did that was because his father had moved there before he was born, and he had lived there for 40 years as, himself someone who was born in Perry County. But because his father was not from Perry County, his father had moved in before his son was born, the son had to always understand that his position was somehow subordinate to those who had been there for generations and generations. I know I'm not from around here, but my opinion isn't quite as important as everybody else, because everybody else has that connection to the land, has that connection to the community that is required for you to, have those kinds of positions of power. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about here. The I'm not from around here, but. And so the difference between how Abraham treats his guests, how Abraham goes out of his way to help these people, to make them comfortable, to make sure they have everything they need, to have the conversation flow in the direction that they want it to flow, is contrasted with these people who are violating Lot's hospitality attempts and violating, they have absolutely no regard for strangers. They believe that strangers are nothing. They believe that strangers are not to be considered any kind of anything worth anything. So I think what this is kind of teaching us is that the way that we treat those who don't belong in the eyes of society, the poor, the homeless, the aliens, people who don't fit in, is fundamental, is critical to understanding what God's righteousness and justice are all about. But then I still have questions, when it comes to this, because God destroyed all of these people, and it does say in the story that every single man in the city was part of this thing. But was everybody really that bad? There were women and children involved here too. Is it fair that God destroyed them too? What about the innocent bystanders? And an author named Seamus Haney, who has the most famous translation of the ancient narrative Beowulf, of all things, he has a poem that I really like. That's just one sentence. He cut up the lines to turn it into a poem, because that's what we do. I'm not a big poetry person, but it says, "Bystanders are never innocent." That's the entire poem. And I think in a way that's true. If you are standing by, if you are watching something happening and you don't act when you see someone that needs something, then you're not innocent. You are choosing, by your inaction, you are choosing an action, and your action is not to help, not to get involved, not to participate, not to do justice. It's kind of like Martin Luther's interpretations of the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not murder. But if you are not actively attempting to help your neighbor in all ways, all the time, then you are murdering. You are contributing to the murder of your neighbor. And that's a pretty high bar. I know I couldn't possibly meet that. But that's kind of what we're talking about here with this story. So any questions, comments about any of that with this passage? Anything you see here? I know we didn't read it, but anything that kind of stands out that we didn't discuss from this story?
Well, in thinking about the things that are going on today with people who, are coming into our country, or the homeless situation that is growing exponentially, we're not doing a very good job.
No.
Or not.
And I guess I struggle with this thing of this being the core, the basis of God's direction to us. And yet there's so many people that don't want to care for the poor, don't want to care for those who have no home. I have a hard time bringing that together with their idea of Christianity, I guess.
Yeah. Bootstraps and enabling come up a lot as a, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, even if you don't have any. And we don't want to give you anything because that will enable you. And I don't think doesn't fit with this. Am I missing something?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's, and I think it comes back to the conversation that we are having, like the topic of our class here, when we talk about, what is violence? If violence is violating the order of creation, then kind of what we're doing, and I say we because I do it myself when I drive down and hit the corner of Hilltop and Cypress. I don't know what to do and feel awkward, and if I catch the eyes of one of the people that's standing on the corner, I kind of try to smile and nod, but I know that's not actually accomplishing anything. What we're doing is we are focusing on our own place. What do I have? How do I preserve my stuff, my position of power, my belongings, my money, my property, my comfort, my stability in the way that our society is run, my ability to communicate, if we're talking about people who come from other countries that speak differently and have different culture, my chosen, my preferred way of life. How do I protect those things? How do I elevate those things? And fundamentally, choosing to protect and defend that over protecting and defending the need for justice and righteousness for all of these different populations of people who need it is doing violence against them, against ourselves, and against God. And I'm not saying that, just saying that is going to fix all the problems, because we can all just agree that that's true and then move on. Because there are, when you get down into the weeds of it, there are fundamental problems with constantly just giving handouts to people and enabling and asking people to take steps to show that they really do want to improve their lives and things like that. All that stuff is valid to include in the conversation. But I think fundamentally as Christians, our job is to wrestle with that stuff constantly and not just to use those things as excuses, which I think happens a lot. But that's where I am with it. But then I still do nothing. I get frustrated and upset about how it's being handled, but what am I doing about it? I send my Christmas donation to Bread for the World and, go about my business, but that's basically doing nothing. So now that I've made everybody feel guilty, shall we move on to Egypt?
I don't feel entirely guilty.
No?
Well, because, some people need help, but some people don't want help.
Mm-hmm.
They're choosing to,
So what? Make a statement.
live the way they're living and leave their trash everywhere. I mean, there's different ways to look at it, and
Yeah,
tough one.
I think that kind of takes us back to our conversation from last week about the song that they were singing, that if you are on the face of it the oppressed person, and something happens to you that kind of alleviates your oppression just a little bit, even for a moment. So for example, you come into some money and you go and you buy yourself a package of lunch meat and a loaf of bread. Is it right that just because you are among oppressed people for you to consume that and then leave the trash on the ground? No, because you now are the oppressor. You are doing violence to the creation. You are polluting God's good earth. You are violating the order of and the goodness of that ground, that tree, that what have you. And so I think that's part of why it's so complicated, because
Right.
no human is completely innocent. If you are a person who is being oppressed by the larger institutions of poverty and um, fear of um, fear of people who are coming in from other countries and things like that, that in itself doesn't make you completely innocent of the oppressions that you commit against others and against other parts of God's creation. And I think that's why it's so complicated and challenging to navigate through.
Yeah.
But I think again, this is me talking to myself here, but I think that we can't use those things as an excuse not to act, not to try to wrestle with those things and figure out how to move forward together, which we do.
And figuring
You
out
know,
what really is helping.
Yeah.
yeah, you're torn in so many different directions because we know so much more, than back in the old days. You only knew about your neighbors. Now we know about the whole world,
Right.
and it's overwhelming. It's
Yeah.
like going in the grocery store and there's 10, there's more than that, kinds of bread, it's overwhelming.
Yeah. This is these kinds of stories are coming from a place where a stranger is not somebody that you see very often. You could go your entire life at this point, and depending on where you lived, literally never see somebody that you didn't grow up next to, because that's just how it was. You lived in your little family group among your tribe, and you intermarried, and maybe you interacted with the tribe next door. But there was no such thing as upward mobility, as transients, in terms of people deciding, oh well, I don't really like living in Reading anymore, I'm going to move to Chicago. That's not a thing, at this time. And so how do we, as people living in the modern world, deal with this when we're not talking about showing compassion for one stranger or one group of strangers that travels through once a year or less, and we obviously have enough to to help them? But what we're talking about is more than we as individuals, we as a church, we as if somehow every Christian in the country decided that we all agreed on some of this stuff, even we all together wouldn't have the resources to make it happen. And so how do we deal with that? How do we address the bigger complications, the fact that we are more aware? And I think what we've done, unfortunately, is the more aware we become, the less active we become, because we feel paralyzed to do anything, and so we just do nothing. And so what is it that we can do to make a positive difference? What is it that we can do to try to reverse some of the violence that's been done, to try to reestablish God's good order in the world? And, you know, how do we do that, not just in the face of such overwhelming problems, but also in the face of other people of good and bad faith who disagree with us on the way that we're supposed to do it, because there are different ways to go about it.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Thanks, bye-bye.
All right, well, I do want to get to a little bit of a conversation about Egypt, because I kind of thought this was exciting and interesting, and I never heard of it before, and I wanted to share with you. So, you know, we've got kind of Sodom as an example of God acting in, you know, in violence, that they are destroyed. I think that this story is supposed to be read not as a history, but again as a model for, you know, how this works, as a lesson, as almost kind of a fable related to how violence, you know, corrupts not just the people, but even also the creation itself. When you get down to, let's see, where are we? Why can't I find it? Well, I can't find it, but somewhere in here it talks about the destruction doesn't leave anything in doesn't leave anything green on the plain. That it was described, Sodom and Gomorrah was described as a place of great, you know, kind of great agricultural prosperity, and then somewhere it talks about everything was blackened and there was nothing left. But for some reason I can't find it. So anyway, point being that this is trying to teach us a lesson about, you know, how our violence, our refusal to be the people God calls us to be, to live within the good order and to promote the good order, results not just in the destruction of ourselves, but the destruction of bystanders who, as we're saying, are not innocent, but are still, you know, kind of pulled into it. And also the creation itself, the literal other stuff that is not human, is also affected by this stuff.
It was in verse 25.
25, is that where it is?
Yeah.
Ah, yes, and what grew on the ground. They had to make sure that they threw that in there. Thank you. So, moving forward then to our other story, I want to talk mostly about Pharaoh, because I think, you know, we've got this this challenge with who is this guy, and why is it that God seems to manipulate him so that additional violence can be done. That just seems like that's not fair, especially because, again, we've got these quote unquote innocent bystanders involved who end up suffering greatly because of all of this. So again, I think that, you know, the first thing that we have to acknowledge or think about is, I think, once again, the story of Moses going into Egypt to free the Israelites and his interactions with Pharaoh are not meant to be a historical account. It's supposed to again, be a story about the morals or the values of the Israelite people. And so, you know, some people have attempted to figure out, you know, which Pharaoh would this be? But Pharaoh intentionally, I think, does not have a name in this story, in this story, and can't be pinned down historically. And I think this is on purpose because Pharaoh isn't just Pharaoh in the story. Pharaoh is meant to represent something bigger than himself. He's supposed to represent evil, that which is violent in the world, that which is violent even within ourselves, because Pharaoh is a human character. He's an archetype for that which opposes God. Just an interesting aside. I don't know if any of you have ever encountered this in reading, but anything that anyone who lived and thought about these kinds of questions before World War II, and anyone who was writing about these kinds of questions before World War II, used Pharaoh as the go-to bad guy. But then after World War II, it became Hitler. So anytime we say they're like Nazis, they're that's like Hitler. Hitler's a that the point is that it becomes like Hitler isn't just Hitler anymore. Hitler is the epitome of evil. Hitler is the reference to Hitler, is the intention there is to say there's nothing redeemable. It's all evil. It's the complete antithesis of that which is good and right and just in the world. And before Hitler came around, that person was Pharaoh in our culture. For thousands of years, it was Pharaoh. So sorry, Pharaoh, you just lost your number one place. So we'll see how long Hitler lasts until somebody else comes along. And so to read this story from that perspective, I think can help us, to see this as bigger than just the story, and not that it's not big, but bigger than just the story of the redemption of the Israelites. But I think it's about God's work to redeem the entirety of what God created, from the powers of chaos, from kind of the anti-creator that lives within all of us, that we are all capable of being. That's the scariest part, I think, about a Hitler figure, about a Pharaoh figure, is that we all have that penchant for violence and being power hungry and controlling. And so that's why we're so fascinated by these kinds of stories and the history of World War II, for example. And so the family of Abraham represents, all of creation in terms of God and God was working prosperity and blessing through them. And so in the story of the Exodus, and that we see constantly that God is blessing them. So, I'm not going to look specifically at particular passages, but if you've got it open and you've got chapter 1 there, both in verse 7, the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so the land was filled with them. And then also verse 20, again it says, so God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And so even when Pharaoh is trying to literally kill them, literally commit genocide against them by killing all the boys, the baby boys, God gives that blessing. God gives that wholeness. God gives that prosperity to them, which is a reference back to the, be fruitful and multiply command that God gave to the humans at creation, and then again after Noah reestablished society, and brought all the animals off the ark. And so this is a story of Pharaoh attempting to uncreate what God created, to undermine what God created, and God working to prevent that, and not just to prevent it, but to establish reestablish that good order, to crush those forces of chaos. So here's the thing that I found as I was working on this that I thought was really fascinating, and I'll be interested to see what you all think, whether this is you know, a little too much trying to shove a square peg in a round hole, or vice versa. So we have this, we've got the 10 plagues that occur, and this person that I was reading about this suggests that the 10 plagues are actually meant to represent, again, the uncreation of the world by God. Not, in this case, not the entire earth, but within Egypt itself. That God is, or even the creation itself is pulling back, is uncreating in an attempt to destroy that which is threatening the good order of creation. And so where I actually want to go now is back to Genesis chapter 1, so that we can take a look at this. So according to this person, there are what he calls, or she calls, probably he, the 10 utterances of creation, that God speaks 10 times to create all that exists in Genesis chapter 1, and that each one of those utterances goes along with one of these plagues. They're not all in order, but they are all there. So the first plague is the plague of the blood. Aaron touches the water with his staff, and the water all turns to blood. And this guy says that connects to the utterance of God in Genesis chapter 1, verses 9 to 10. Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. So, you know, okay, it has to do with water and gathering in one place, and the water is useful and necessary and can be used to grow things, but the blood is the opposite of that. The blood is icky and smelly and cannot sustain life. Then the second one is the frogs, and this person says that this has to do with chapter 1, verse 20 of the creation story. Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dim of the sky. And so the frogs represent, you know, because they're amphibians, they represent the creatures that come out of the water. And the use of this word swarm is actually the same word that's used in the plagues, but the swarms that come out of the water during creation are good. They are ordered and balanced and have the right numbers, and they disperse and go where they're supposed to go. Whereas the swarms of frogs that come out of the waters in the plagues don't do that. They are too many. They are unbalanced. They are in the wrong place. They are bothersome to and problematic for the Egyptians. And so they are, you know, kind of the opposite of the goodness of the order of creation for the frogs. The lice in that's the third plague goes with verse 24. Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things and wild animals of the earth of every kind. And so now we've got creeping things, these lice that are bothersome to the Egyptians. And then similarly, the flies, which is number 4, goes with verse 22. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters and the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth. So the flies represent the multiplication of the things of the air, not being fruitful, but being destructive. Then we get to number 5, which is the pestilence that kills all the cattle and animals. And this goes, according to this person, with the utterance in verse 28, which, and 28, which says, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." And so this is kind of an allusion to the second creation story in chapter 2, where it talks about how the animals were created for Adam to help him, to sustain him, to work for him. And so this pestilence uncreates that. It takes away that relationship with the cattle and the beasts of the field, because the pestilence kills them all and takes them away from the Egyptians. Then we get to number 6. Are we on now? And this is the one that I think I have, the hardest time with. It's a little bit of a stretch, but I'll tell you anyway and see what you think. So this one they're claiming that, so this is the plague of the boils, and it goes with verse 14 of the creation story, which in my version says, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth." So what does that have to do with boils? This person suggests that boils, in particular, boils were considered unclean. And so if you had boils, you were not allowed to participate in the ritual of your community. You were not allowed in the temple. You were not allowed to participate in the sacrifices. You were kind of outcast from the routines, from the schedules of your life. And so Genesis 1:14 isn't just the creation of day and night and sun and moon. They are the creation of seasons, of liturgical ritual, of the way that we live our lives, the patterns, the rhythms of the way that we live in relationship to each other and with God. And so by getting the boils, that prevented the Egyptians from participating in that aspect of God's creation. It uncreated the kind of liturgical year. It uncreated the way that we mark our lives, the way that we march through our lives, because everybody was impure and therefore could not participate in the liturgy of life, the changing of the seasons and the signs of how life progresses forward. So, I mean, yeah, I guess you can get there, eventually, but that's where that person went with that.
You're saying it fits the narrative.
Yeah. So Genesis 6 goes with number 7, which is the hail. Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. So the hail, of course, is frozen water and comes down and violates the space between the heavenly waters and the earthly waters, so that the land is not a safe and dry space for people to inhabit. The locusts go with verse 11. Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seeds, and fruit trees of every kind that bear fruit with seed in it, because they ate everything. Darkness, of course, goes with verse 3. Let there be light. There was no light because it was dark, super dark. Everything was completely, you couldn't even see your hand in front of your face. And then finally, the death of the firstborn goes with verse 26. Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. That we are uncreating the most sacred of the creation, which is that which is made in the image of God, the human, especially the firstborn, in the way that God's firstborn of creation was Adam, and created in God's image. the firstborn of the Egyptians is taken away, uncreated, killed off. So what do you think about that? I thought that was really interesting. I'd never heard of that before.
I never gave it any association at all.
No. I find it interesting in light of our, in light of our topic here about violence, because we are focusing so much on God, violence as opposition to God's good creation. And so if this is a story about, the forces of good and the forces of evil, the forces of God's good order, battling against the forces of violence that reside in the hearts of all humanity, then it is helpful. It is interesting. It is, the idea that this is kind of a mini flood, a mini reversal of creation in an attempt to get the attention of the Egyptians and make them understand what it is that they are doing, that they are violating, they are threatening the good order because of the way that they are living and the way that they're treating the Israelites. Then I find it interesting and compelling to a certain degree. Like I said, the Boyles one I think is kind of a stretch, but you usually end up with that when you're trying to make correlations among groups of things. You get to the bottom and you're like, oh, I've got these two things left. What am I supposed to do with this? All right, so then I have one more thing to talk about, and then I think we can wrap it up for today. I want to talk about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, because this is where, we kind of get back to our innocent bystanders thing. If Pharaoh didn't have any say in how he responded to this stuff because God caused it to happen, then is it fair for all of this to have happened, not just to him, but also to his subjects, the Egyptians? And of course we can say things like, well, this is from this time, this isn't from a time when there was like the right of the individual, the people, the Pharaoh represented the people, and so the people were just as bad and things like that. But I found it interesting. I went through and I found all of the occasions that the phrase Pharaoh's heart was hardened or heart hardened in Pharaoh occurred. And the first time that this occurs is in chapter 7, verse 13. And the last time that it occurs is in chapter 14, verse 8. And if you put them all in order, there actually is a progression about how they are, how they're phrased and how they're put together. So early in verses 7, 8, a little bit of 9.
What chapter?
So I'm looking at like chapter 7, 8, and 9 of Exodus right now. So 7:13 is the first occasion when this appears. Chapter 7, verse 13. It says, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. So it's the passive voice. And that continues for the most part. In chapter 8, verse 15, it says, he, Pharaoh, hardened his heart. And so it attributes it to Pharaoh. But it's not until we get to chapter 9, after we've already had like 6 or 7 occurrences of this, that finally it says, the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, that it actually attributes the hardening of the heart to God. And so, and then after that, you start to have a little bit more of a mixture. So you get the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and then you get Pharaoh hardened his heart. Then you go back to the heart of Pharaoh was hardened. Then you get the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart in order that I may show these signs of mine among them. And then we get, after that, all the rest of them are the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. There are 4 more after that. And it's all attributed to the Lord. So I thought that was really interesting that we, kind of make this assumption that it's always God doing it. But at first, we don't know. It's passive. It says Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Then it's Pharaoh doing it. He hardens his own heart. Then it's the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. The Lord did this. And I don't know necessarily what to do with that. But I did notice as I was looking through for these things, the order of how this occurs. It's not that Pharaoh has a hard heart, and so the plague happens to punish his hard heart. The plague happens, and then it says that Pharaoh's heart is hardened. And so I don't think the problem that we're supposed to see here is that Pharaoh is being stubborn and God needs to punish him. I think the problem is that Pharaoh refuses to see the significance of the plagues, of these signs that God is doing. The signs are not to punish Pharaoh. The signs are there to get Pharaoh's attention, to make Pharaoh understand what it is that he is doing in being kind of anti-creation and being part of these forces of chaos. That the plagues are the natural result of Pharaoh's behaviors, but Pharaoh refuses to see that connection. That, the very earth itself is undoing itself, is violating its good order because of the way that he is treating the Israelites, because of the way that he is acting in opposition to the sovereignty of God. And so he hardens his heart against coming to that conclusion so that he doesn't have to change his mind, so that he can continue on this path of control and self-adulation and bringing more power to himself, taking away the good ordered place of others for his own benefit. And so I felt like that was, something that I need to think about. Where do I refuse to see the significance of events in our world? How am I hardening my heart when I see things happening in the world that are, perhaps not God making them happen, but kind of the world itself, the earth itself, the groups of people themselves crying out and showing me the consequences of the way that I live and the way that we as a society treat each other and treat the world. And in what ways am I hardening my heart to those things? And how should I instead be opening myself to that message that, these are the natural consequences of the way we treat each other, of the way that we treat the earth, and needing to change that, even if it means giving up control, putting myself back into where I'm supposed to be in God's order and helping others to do the same. So that's all I've got for today in my notes. Any questions, comments, additional thoughts?
That made sense, what you said about it. The natural order, and I'm thinking about the problems we've had with drought and fires and so many things. I mean, it seems like the natural order has been so disturbed that somebody's trying to get our attention,
Mm.
And so maybe that is God's way of showing us that we have to take care of this earth,
Mm-hmm.
the earth and the people. I mean, over and over and over again, the theme that I keep hearing from all of this is that we need to take care of things. We've been given the stewardship and we need to do that,
Yeah, and that violence is not just the violation of that, but our negligence too,
Right. Right.
taking care of each other and the other, the creation itself, and let God worry about taking care of us, which is hard. I'm not, that certainly isn't an easy thing to do.
Right.
Any thoughts, Pat or Steve or Pam?
Oh, we went wide afield today. All sorts of interesting linkages.
Yeah. Well, I encourage you to give it some more thought. I'm certainly going to continue to ponder that progression of the hardening hearts thing, because I wrestled with that and tried to think about it and did a little reading, and I just didn't come up with a good conclusion to offer for what's going on with that. So if you have any thoughts, I would love to hear those next week.
Okay.
I do like reading these passages from the perspective of our new definition of, or for me, the new definition of violence.
Yeah, I found that in the book that I'm reading, so that's not something that I'd ever looked at either. And at first I thought, gosh, this is never going to work, but so far I think it's really holding up, and it's helping me to look at it from a really fresh perspective, and it's framing things in a helpful and I think logical and truthful way. I like it.
Yeah, it helps to, I don't know if it makes anything really crystal clear, but it helps to understand a little more some of these actions, especially in the Old Testament. And
Yeah.
you read these stories and think, "How could God do that?"
Yeah. Yeah.
So it kind of helps me put things in a little different light.
Yeah, it's helped me too with the creation, the creation and the uncreation. That has been a really
Yes.
interesting thought for me.
Yeah, me too. And we want to get back to the creation.
Right.
We want to uncreate the uncreated.
Katie,
Yes.
in Exodus 4:21, it talks about God hardening Pharaoh's heart. And all this is about the start.
I will harden his heart. Yeah, I must have missed that one because it said, I will harden his heart, and Pharaoh's name wasn't in there.
Yeah, so that he will not let the people go.
Yeah.
So it's just like he's gonna make sure he doesn't let them go. So
Right. Yeah, that's, I mean, I'm still struggling with that. Why would God not why would God refuse to have Pharaoh let them go, just so that all this bad stuff could happen, so that God could show how powerful and awesome. I mean, I'm still really struggling with that one. So please, if you have any thoughts about that next week, I will be happy to talk about it. Even if it takes our whole lesson plan and throws it out the window, we just talk about that. That would be great, because I need to figure it out.
Okay.
What's the name of the book that you were referring to?
It's just called Violence in the Bible, or Violence in Scripture, and it fell into my lap almost, because when we were doing the Daniel class and talking about some of the violence in those later chapters, I got it in an email from the Presbyterian publishing house that I've bought from in the past, and they said, hey, we're having a huge sale, here are some of the books that you can get, and it said Violence in Scripture, and I was like, hey, here it is. So I'm using a lot of insights from that as we move through this. Not everything is from this book. I'm looking at some of my other books too, but that's pretty much, you know, kind of the main text that I'm using. All right. Well, if everybody is sort of satisfied for today, then we can wrap it up and gather again next week. And hopefully one of you will have an epiphany and tell me what's going on with hardening Pharaoh's heart, and then we can move on to the next thing.
Okay.
Thank you all for another great conversation. Have a good week.
All right, thanks, Katie.
Yep,
Thank
take
you.
care.